Good evening, Americans. Welcome to the Ed Show. I'm Michael Eric Dyson, in for Ed Schultz as he prepares to start his new weekend show. A Republican senator comes out for gay marriage 2 years after his son tells him he's gay. Sarah Palin and Karl Rove are at each other's throats. The Republican autopsy is in, but they're still stuck on slavery. What the devil is going on with the History Channel? And the architects of the Iraq War are still wrong a decade later. But tonight, we start in Steubenville, Ohio. This is the Ed Show, and as Ed would say, let's get to work. Let's begin with the facts. 2 members of the Steubenville high school football team were found guilty this weekend of raping a 16-year-old girl last year. Judge Thomas Lips handed down the verdicts in juvenile court.
Regarding the charges of rape, both defendants, Malik Richmond and Trenton Mays, are committed to the Department of Youth Services for a minimum period of 1 year, a maximum period till you're 21.
The defendants were taken into custody and sent to a juvenile detention center. They await an assessment of where they will be placed to serve their sentences. 16-year-old Malik Richmond was found delinquent on charges of rape that carry a minimum of 1 year in detention. 17-year-old Trent Mays was found delinquent on charges of rape and illegal use of a minority in nudity-oriented material. He was sentenced to a minimum of 2 years in juvenile detention center for his offense against a minor. Both teens could remain in juvenile detention until they are 21. Those are the basic facts of Sunday's verdict. But the immediate reaction to the news was driven almost entirely by emotion.
I cannot imagine, having just watched this on the feed coming in, how emotional that must have been sitting in the courtroom.
The emotion being discussed was not of the victim or the victim's family. It was a reaction to the defendants breaking down in court. Both of them sobbed and offered words of regret minutes before hearing their fates. So in response to the news of a guilty verdict in a rape case, the story was defined by the suffering of the accused.
It was incredibly emotional, incredibly difficult, even for an outsider like me, to watch what happened as these 2 young men that had such promising futures, star football players, very good students, literally watched as they believed their life fell apart.
Many would argue their lives fell apart the moment they engaged in rape, a sex crime they have been convicted of in court. The coverage of the verdict exploited whatever emotion was conveniently available at the moment. In this instance, it was the emotion of 2 young men who were facing the consequences of their actions. Their actions were downplayed and their punishment was judged. And in so doing, the media gave tacit approval to blame the victim. The flood of reactions on social media are a testament to that. Countless messages included sexual taunts toward the teenage girl, saying she should have been aware of her surroundings and blaming her for drunken decisions that ruined innocent lives. 2 16-year-old girls have been arrested for making death threats to the victim on Twitter. Ohio Attorney General Mike DeWine struck a different note when addressing the verdict. He seemed to remember the person who was actually the victim of a crime.
The prosecutor's most important duty is to seek justice. And I believe what we saw today is, in fact, justice. My heart goes out to the victim and her family.
DeWine added another sentiment. He said every rape is a tragedy. In this instance, those covering the story would have done well to remember who perpetrated this tragedy and who was a victim of it. Get your cell phones out. I want to know what you think. Tonight's question, did the media lose sight of the real victim in the Steubenville case? Text A for yes, text B for no to 67622 or go to our blog at ed.msnbc.com. I'll bring you the results later in the show. I'm joined by Zerlina Maxwell, political analyst and a contributor to thegrio.com, Arin Carmon, writer for Salon.com, and Salamisha Tillett, professor at the University of Pennsylvania and co-founder of A Long Walk Home. Ladies, thank you for joining me. Zerlina, why did this particular story create the type of reaction we just saw, where there was such a fierce emotional investment in those who perpetuated the crime and not that woman who was the victim?
Well, I think first we need to put this into context in the larger dynamic of rape culture. And so this is one of the 3% of cases where rapists are actually convicted and punished for their crime. And so this is the minority of cases, but also I think we all operate under this rape culture that I keep talking about in many of my articles, and that is because we put the blame and the responsibility on women to prevent rape. And instead, we should be empathizing with victims and not blaming victims, and also supporting victims and being a support system and an advocate so that they themselves are not re-victimized by the rest of us when the focus is on what they should have done to prevent it, and instead it's not on the people that perpetrated the crime.
Right. Erin, obviously there was a re-traumatization of the victim herself as a result of being tried in the court of public opinion and then demonized more broadly in what Zerlina has talked about as a rape culture. Does the reaction to this story illustrate a problem with the way people are educated about rape and consent?
Absolutely. I mean, I think given the age of the offenders, given the age of the victims, it is so clear that the perpetrators were operating with impunity, that the education about consent needs to begin much earlier, that they believed that they were above the law, and that when they were documenting it, they didn't realize that what they were doing is they were creating evidence in a criminal case. They believed that because the coach had their backs, which suggests that this is a long-standing cultural issue, that absolutely nothing would happen to them. So instead of focusing on the victim's behavior, what we should be focusing on is how do we intervene in this culture that tells boys that they don't have to respect women as human beings, and if they sexually humiliate young girls, absolutely nothing will happen to them. So if there's anything that we can learn from this one verdict, it is the fact that people need to understand what consent is, what substantial impairment is, and intervene in a toxic culture of masculinity.
Professor Tillett, speaking about the toxic culture of masculinity that Ms. Carmon just spoke of, you, of course, spend a great deal of time away from the classroom trying to educate both young women and young men about these issues. The mother of the victim actually delivered a statement in court to the defendants. She said, in part, "Your decisions that night affected countless lives, including those most dear to you. You were your own accuser through the social media that you chose to publish your criminal conduct on. This does not define who my daughter is. She will persevere, grow, and move on. I have pity for both of you. I hope you fear the Lord, repent for your actions, and pray hard for his forgiveness." In a situation where a victim's identity needs to be protected, is there a responsibility for those words to be heard and heard widely?
Yes, and I think the other responsibility is for the media to understand what recovering from sexual assault is like. So I think that was the big problem here. Not only was there kind of over-sympathy for the defendants in this case, but there was a seeming lack of concern for what rape actually does to victims of sexual assault. The stats are overwhelming. It's 25% of women who experience sexual assault are going to try to commit suicide. It's the #1 reason women drop out of college. It's the #1 reason why girls drop out of high school. And about 60 to 80% of women who are incarcerated have already experienced sexual assault. So the long legacy of sexual assault and how it impairs victims seems to have been lost in this process as people were overly sympathizing or overly grieving for the defendants.
And not only were they overly sympathizing and grieving for the defendant, there seems to be, Zerlina, a kind of meta-narrative going on here. If we were in a schoolroom, we would talk about there's the narrative, then there's the narrative on the narrative. So the reaction of the media was striking here. Here's more of the media reaction immediately following the verdict.
What's the lasting effect, though, on two young men being found guilty in juvenile court of rape, essentially?
Is it unusual for there to be such profound sympathy for the guilty parties, or do you think there's something different about this specific case that kind of captured the imagination of the nation?
Well, certainly we have two football players, and so I think in the United States we lionize athletes to a degree that is really unnecessary. But, you know, in reality, the reaction is not any different from, rape cases all over the country. Many times women are internalize this greater narrative of rape culture, and they blame themselves while they think that they don't want to press charges because they're going to ruin the perpetrator's life. And that is wrong, and that's what we need to change. We need to change the conversation entirely and focus on the choices and the actions of the person who committed the crime. Because the only reason that rape happens is rapists choose to commit rape. That is what we need to be talking about. And instead, we always talk about what the victims could have done and should have done to avoid rape, and that's completely wrong.
Erin, how do we push past this kind of over-identification with the two young men, the boys in this case, and focus squarely again on this female victim? Because it seems that some people are blaming the victim because either they knew details of the case or didn't care or didn't know, like the damning text messages the defendant sent. Do you think people were aware of the broader context of this case?
Well, I'm inspired by the bravery of this young woman who testified in front of her accusers and who went against the tide in a town that worshipped football and football players. And I'm very inspired by her mother's statement as well, where she says that her daughter won't be defined by it. In terms of the town now, it looks like there's going to be a grand jury convened. I think there are a lot of unanswered questions when it comes to the actions of the coach and his failure to report a sex crime that he was aware of and that, according to the text messages, he laughed off. I think that there is a lot of questions about the behavior of the boys who were there, some of whom have struck deals for immunity. They had the presence of mind. One of the boys did not let his friend drive drunk. And so we need those kinds of interventions when it comes to sexual assault. If you see somebody who is vulnerable to a predator, if you see someone who is about to breach someone's boundaries of consent, you have to, in the same way that you grab their keys, you have to put a stop to it. And there were so many opportunities in this tragic case that moving beyond requires recognizing how it could have been stopped.
Yeah, well, that's a difficult transition, but we've got to focus on how do we develop empathy for those who are at risk in terms of sexual assault to the same degree as we do for somebody driving drunk, like Ms. Carmone just said. Professor Tillett, do you think stories like this make it more difficult for victims of sexual assault to feel that they can come forward? There's a huge stigma and a great deal of empathy, it seems, for those who commit the crime and not for those who are its victim.
Yeah, in general, I think that's the case. But I do think this situation and the guilty verdict here may lead young girls and women to come forward, lead to more women and more girls to come forward. I would hope so. I'd hope that would be the response. And I think the mother's language here about her daughter's strength and her perseverance really helps survivors understand that this isn't just one woman's story or one girl's story. It's many of our stories. So, yes, I would hope it would make a difference. But each time these cases become public spectacles, as we know, whether it was 2011 in Cleveland, Texas, where an 11-year-old girl was sexually assaulted by 18 men and boys, or whether it's a high-profile case, it always leads to survivors to sort of suffocating their experiences and holding in their stories more and not coming forward and getting the justice that they rightly deserve.
Well, let's all hope that we can help these people in that particular city, but across America, exhale with a great sigh for justice. Zerlina Maxwell, Erin Carmone, and Professor Salamisha Tillett, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Remember to answer tonight's question there at the bottom of the screen and share your thoughts on Twitter @EdShow and on Facebook. I want to know what you think. A Republican senator now supports gay marriage because of his son. I'll tell you what, it might be too little, too late. Stay tuned.